A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships.
Actually, what I thought about most was the statement looking at top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance. Hey, that's where I was for decades, decades and decades. And it wasn't until I understood that, no, it's not the truth. Life is different, and we all have to make adjustments to those different ways we have to deal with that stuff.
Well, it's that part of that big lie, right? That I need those things to be okay. I need everyone to like me. I need to feel good all the time. I need to feel that the relationship is perfect for it to be okay. See, it's such a seductive idea that we swallow so whole and uncritically, don't we? And you're
Yeah,
right.
we really do. We really don't learn how to solve problems.
Well, we don't, yeah, that's right. And we don't learn to challenge some of these ideas until they don't work. And then we're in pain, right? And then we start
Yeah,
suffering.
then we're in trouble.
Then we're in trouble. Thank you, Susie, so much.
Thank you.
Well, tonight we continue our exploration of living consciously. This is the second insight from my book, and Herb is going to lead us off in the discussion. Herb, good evening and welcome. And I'm looking forward to what you have to say tonight.
Well, thank you, Alan, for creating this space for all of us to learn about consciousness, because that's really the key here. As I was rereading your chapter 4 and putting it in the context of what we've been doing, I joined sort of midstream some time ago, and so I didn't catch the beginning of this origin of this group, but I got in time to be part of the group that was looking at the steps. And we took a lot of time looking at each of the steps. And the total purpose of that process of the steps is awakening. It's right in step 12 itself. Having had a spiritual awakening. It was Bill's way of, Bill Wilson wrote the big book on the step process of saying we've been asleep. So many people, so many teachers, philosophers, etc., spiritual leaders have talked about that over time. Alan, you and I quote Gurdjieff quite a bit, only because he has this wonderful wisdom saying, a Russian philosopher from the 19th century, says most people are asleep, dreaming that they're awake. Now, I only could really appreciate that when I was awake, looking back over my shoulder, seeing that, oh my God, for 48 years, I was asleep emotionally, consciously. I was 4 years sober at the time when I began to have that awakening. And originally, 4 years earlier, I had been exposed through a question and a series of circumstances that are not relevant here. But 4 years earlier, I had received a question that allowed me to see that I was an alcoholic. Now, I was not shocked that I was an alcoholic. I was absolutely shocked that I had never seen it. I have a reflective background in education. I'm reasonably intelligent, fairly well educated, exposed in this introspective environment of philosophy and psychology and theology and spirituality and self-help for all of these years. And I hadn't seen any of this. The addiction, first, so visible. I'm just shocked that I missed it. But then 4 years sober, going to a meeting every day, doing this work of the 12 steps, getting back to the initial exposure to this work, this group here, and seeing that I didn't know that I didn't know about the origins of the mischief in my life. I'll be kind. The mischief in my life coming from me. I had literally been, I could not have verbalized this, but I was a victim of my father or my institutions or my exposure or my bosses or my circumstances. Not that I could have articulated that, but I did lots of therapy around it, individual and group therapy, and attempt to address all of that, and never broke through to any of the real truth. A very low level of consciousness, despite all that effort. Freud says the task of the human being is to make the unconscious conscious. Otherwise, we conclude that we're a victim of fate or other people's malevolence, ill will. That was it. Circumstances made me. People made me. And I was clueless 4 years sober, going to, well, all of the good stuff that we do in a 12-step program. I was a good member by my standards and my sponsor's standards. But I was asleep and I didn't know it. And then this man shared with me, and I've shared it with you. You've seen this. It's really dramatic. He did it in a restaurant when I just revealed to him my background, etc. He said, "Wow, Herb, you got a lot of information, but you have very little transformation. You have a lot of academic knowledge and a serious effort, but it's never translated through your heart, through your feet, to give you an experience of change." I didn't really know what he was talking about, but I knew he did. And I engaged him to help me wake up a process with that 12 steps. But then this group here, this panel, this Thursday night gathering went into the whole area of self-esteem using Nathaniel Brandes' book, 6 Pillars. And in there, he talks about, in a different way, he talks about a 7th pillar. I'm not sure actually really what it is. I looked again at it today. It's a little murky, but it looks like it's consciousness. It looks like it's willingness. And in one of the sentences, he says it's to love yourself, to be aware of that innate goodness that we are. Now, who of us could, maybe even today, articulate that and mean it? Innate goodness, Herb? Oh my goodness, no. I mean, I can fake it. I mean, I have a Hollywood storefront that's fabulous. One of my teachers, other teachers, and that's why it stimulated my thoughts in this area, who called it the core of goodness. He's a Catholic theologian and a monk and a priest, so of course he talks like that. But I took it, a core of goodness, the spark of the divine, made in the image and likeness of. I mean, I had exposure to all these phrases, 7 years of solitude and silence, meditating on all of this stuff, and yet never once had it penetrated as less than just information and poetry, but never an experience. Einstein said the consciousness that creates the problem cannot be the consciousness that solves the problem. See, I knew I could have mouthed that. I didn't, because I had never seen it. But a man shared with me about setting aside my old ideas And he said, oh, by the way, in fact, you're willing to do that. I know that because you're a seeker and you're diligent and you're sincere, well-intentioned. But why don't you embrace it as you're as powerless over setting it aside as you are over your alcohol. You're as powerless as setting it aside as you are over your unmanageability. Pray, have a positive spirit if that antagonizes you in any way. Have a positive energy attitude about an open mind and an open heart as a gift of your willingness to have it. And be willing to detach from or be detached from your thoughts, your knowledge, your experience, your expectations, your beliefs, so that you may be delivered. This is the language he used, so that you may be delivered to a place you don't even know exists. He said, be prepared to be surprised. Because you don't know that you don't know, and you can't see that you don't see, and you've never had an experience with it, so there's no way that you could even listen to the words that I might spin for you and have it make any sense or be real for you. Are you willing to have that open mind and open heart? Are you willing to be delivered to a place that you don't even know exists? You see, he was helping me be conscious that I was unconscious. He was asking me questions that I could hold. One of my teachers says, Richard Rohr, Dr. Berger and I have done quite a bit of work with Richard. And he says, ask the question and hold the question in a milieu of prayer, positive attitude, an open mind and an open heart. Ask the question, hold the question, and let the unanswered question percolate over a period of time as you stay gently pressed up against it. One of my favorite images is the dimmer switch, because it's my experience. When I look back over my shoulder, the lights went on when I quit drinking, when drinking was removed from me is a better phrase. And the lights really went on when I did the work of the 12 steps, because it was a formal process of awakening to get to the underlying causes and conditions of the shadows, the darkness in me, which I had never addressed in that sense, in the simplicity of it, looking at me as the source of instincts gone awry, unhealthy coping strategies, the words that we use here in the emotional sobriety setting. Just my way of attempting to be safe and survive and have a little satisfaction with my life. But it was all because I had incorrect lenses. I was seeing reality incorrectly, and therefore all of my efforts were not wasted, but not as effective as they could be when they had some direction and some counsel. That dimmer switch began to go on, and when I got sober, 1984, and then in 1988 began to turn up a notch at a time, a notch at a time, a day at a time, a meeting at a time, a step at a time, a conversation at a time, incorporating the ingredients of a methodology that I've been given through the 12 steps, as well as supplementing it with the therapy and the self-help and the reading of a book like the Self-Esteem. That's been tremendous. And just last year, we read that, or earlier this year. And it's made a huge difference in my understanding, not of myself, but alone, but of, so I see it as pandemic, that sense of unworthiness that a large majority of people have. But I was not aware of it in the words that I'm using today and the experience that I have today. And so then I can be very helpful by saying, and I've just started saying, whatever we do is good enough. I've never said that before, to myself certainly, but not out loud. Whatever we do is good enough for right now, because I know so many people beat themselves up with high standards. They're not conscious that they have these standards that they're unrealistic about. And if they don't measure up to the standards from outside of themselves, they don't have any internalized standards that they've made their own. And it's never enough. Because I'm not enough. And that's that correlation with the self-esteem work that we did there. And now Dr. Berger and I have been doing lots of work in emotional sobriety. I've come from it, from the 12-step process, seeing step 10 as the key tool of the emotional sobriety, which is about paying attention. We wake up by the end of the 9th step. Well, that's the promise, and it's certainly my experience. We wake up, but then we have a tendency to fall asleep. Dr. Tebow, a psychiatrist that helped Bill Wilson in his early development, both formally of the program, but as well as therapeutically as his own support professional person, he said, Bill got it right. The first 9 steps are for the deflation of the ego at depth. But he said, the ego has an uncanny way of regenerating itself. Brilliant insight. And Bill says, so we watch for the regeneration of the ego. And how would we do that? Well, that's what emotional sobriety is all about. Paying attention, being conscious that I'm disturbed. In fact, in the 12 and 12, Bill calls it the spot check inventory. Spot check. On the spot, when I'm disturbed, he said it's a spiritual axiom. Whenever you're disturbed, there's something amiss. There's something not quite right with you. One of my Southern friends, he said, Herb, he says, you're not quite right. Exactly. I'm, Anyway, so I see step 10 as being conscious, paying attention to being disturbed and owning it. And then doing the course correction so that I'm back in alignment. You've seen me do this before if you've been around me at all with regard to the process of the steps. We have willpower and there is reality unfolding in front of us, and we can go against reality. We have the ability to choose non-reality. We have the ability to impose our story on reality. And when we do that, we suffer, and reality wins every time because reality is immutable, non-negotiable. We need to turn. That's the beauty of the 3rd step and the benefit and outcome of the steps 4 through 9, to be in alignment with reality. I don't turn my will and my life over to God or reality or life or spirit. I turn my will and my life over to the care of God. And I'm empowered to manage my life by living in alignment with principles. The whole point of being conscious is to say, when I'm disturbed, I'm going against reality. I'm going against principles. What's the principle? Oh, that would be rigorous honesty. What's the principle? Oh, that would be simplicity. Oh, what's the principle? That would be consider other people's feelings. Oh my God, really? Yeah. And you will live in balance, and you will live in harmony, and your life will flourish because you'll be in alignment with reality as it's unfolding. I don't have to use words from the big book or spiritual words. I can use words that just speak to our humanity. I want to live in, I want to acknowledge reality as it is, and moment to moment be present in my as much consciousness as I can, and I sponsor that consciousness. I foster that consciousness with a morning practice of meditation and an evening practice of review and a daily practice of spotting when I'm disturbed. And if I don't spot it, somebody else might, and they will tell me, and I've invited that kind of feedback and accountability. The light and the shadows, it's a wonderful metaphor. It sort of just keeps it really simple. I want to live in the light, and I want to be as conscious as possible. And the dimmer switch goes up a notch at a time, connecting me to light. And the really good news from at least my assumption, my philosophy, my theology, the really good news is the light is infinite. There's always going to be more light, and life is an adventure. And it dispels the darkness, and it shows me the path, and my life flourishes. Well, thank you. Almost felt like bringing you to the altar.
Thank you, Herb. Let me bring in Roger and Alan back in.
I want to say amen.
Yeah, exactly.
It was wonderful, Herb. Wait, doing this a long time, and I just get to see the evolution in you in terms of it just the way that you're starting to integrate all of these ideas, and it keeps getting richer, or you keep getting richer and more nuanced, more textured in understanding of this. And it's just a delight to watch how you are evolving and unfolding. And that's what this is about, isn't it? I mean, that is your consciousness that I'm witnessing unfolding, right? On this path. And
well, that's why I wanted to acknowledge the 3 books that we've been looking at. It just in my short duration, they've all had an impact.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Raj. Why don't you take a shot, and then I'll be the caboose kid.
I enjoy your talk so much, Herb. You really, I mean, you always have great things to say, but you really were so connected tonight and flowing to me with you, right? With who you are, more than any particular set of ideas or anything like that. So I really appreciate that. And there was so much good content, as always. But yeah, it was definitely had a coming to the altar feel about it that I experienced as well. Gosh, there was a lot in there, Herb. 2 or 3 things that stood out to me. God, no wonder you value the importance of questions so much, Herb, with the kinds of questions that the gentleman in that restaurant was asking you. I'm just so struck by that those were really deep, provocative, interesting, and meaningful questions. And I love how you talk about being willing to be in the search for the answer, right? Being willing to lean up against gently, you said, but for as long as needed. Me, I'll try to jump to answers a lot of the time, but what I count on is they're probably going to change before very long. That's why I write down a lot of the presentations I do, because every time I go through it to read it, just to time it, I rewrite about 1/3 of what I've written, because the ideas just keep coming, or different points of emphasis keep coming, and so on. But I just wanted to, acknowledge that point, that I really can see even more deeply now why being asked important questions has had so much value for you, because you've had the willingness to look for the answers.
Right.
And that leads me to the second thing. One of my favorite psychotherapists, who I've mentioned before, a psychiatrist who's been dead since 1980, named Milton Erickson. He did a lot of hypnotherapy throughout his career, but he was also famous for regular therapy with individuals and families, especially what came to be called strategic or solution-focused therapy, often fairly short-term and quite behaviorally oriented. He wanted to help people now. And he believed that, how did he put it, that behavioral change will lead to insight more often than insight will lead to behavioral change, which I've always thought was really profound. Not to put down insight, but you were talking about that, Herb. You had all this knowledge, right? Some of it personal and so on, but it didn't touch your heart, and it didn't impact your behavior.
Correct.
Very much. Another of his sayings that I like so much is, enlightenment is always preceded by confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Enlightenment is always preceded by disorientation. And he would intentionally try to confuse his patients in a session. He'd start to tell a story that made no sense, or a story that was not relevant at all, not go on the whole session with it, but just to disorient the client from their usual ways of holding on to old ideas.
Yeah.
So that's the other theme you mentioned that I really wanted to follow up with, because we often need help with that. Those questions were a huge part for you of starting to even become aware of how locked you were, or I am, or Alan is, or all of us are, into our old ideas. So that leads me to say that part of what we need to be willing to do is to tolerate the anxiety of being uncertain.
That's
Be
huge.
willing not to hold too tightly, be too attached to, too identified with a particular viewpoint, right? Or a particular feeling that I have about something. Because the more tightly locked I am, that is the right viewpoint, at least for me, but probably, knowing me, for everyone, right? At least for until I see better. It's going to preclude the possibility of anything new.
Yeah.
I'm frozen. I'm stuck. And it doesn't mean we can't have conviction. And it doesn't mean we can't try to align our behavior with our convictions, which is one way we talk about the meaning of integrity, with our values. But so that was another piece, is not holding too tightly, not being too attached to any particular point of view. Humility is obviously a really big piece of being willing to question and look at our old beliefs. One of the beliefs that I have is that part of the reason that we struggle so much with tolerating pain and depression and anxiety and anger, and I certainly do still much of the time in my life, especially if it concerns something really important to me, or especially someone really important to me, is a big part of us, no matter how old we are, for many of us, a big part of us does not have an experience that we've grown up in the course of our life. We still feel a lot like a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old or an 11-year-old when we get hit by certain feelings, and they can be as overwhelming to us if we're 97 or 72, like me, as they felt. So one of the things I try to stay aware of for myself is not to buy completely my feeling of being overwhelmed by certain emotions. That my ability to tolerate it and deal with it, and especially to be able to talk about it with a trusted other, might be quite a bit greater than I'm imagining it is. So that plays into the idea of holding on to old ideas too. And the last thing I'll say regarding holding on to old ideas is a quote from Nathaniel Brandon. He's talking about self-concept. The greatest barrier to achievement and success is not lack of talent or ability, but rather the fact that achievement and success above a certain level are outside of our self-concept, our image of who we are and of what's appropriate for me, what's okay for me. And the greatest barrier to love, which you've referenced numerous times, Herb, is the secret fear that I am unlovable, or as we talk about it, that I'm unworthy of love. Again, the seeds of that are sown for most of us in our family of origin, usually not through anyone's intent, but just through ignorance, just through lack of awareness and behavior. The greatest barrier to happiness is that happiness is not my proper destiny, not my proper, experience in my life. Again, old ideas. We form that self-concept as we're growing up in our family of origin. And it's very hard to shift a lot of those ideas, hard to become aware of them in the first place. But if we're gifted, usually very uncomfortably so, if we're gifted the ability to become aware of how locked we are into old ideas about ourselves, then we can begin to shift them. So thank you so much, Herb, for all that you shared tonight, man. Thank you.
Yeah, there was an interesting discussion going on in the chat room as somebody asked to repeat that statement that you made, Roger, about behavioral change leading to insight, more than the other way around. But, I modified it to say, I think it's experience that leads to insight. See, and that experience can have many different dimensions to it. Sometimes it's a behavioral thing. Sometimes it's a cognitive thing that it might. We see something and we learn something from a different perspective. A very, very famous psychotherapist, Bateson, says oftentimes that the dilemma that we experience is a lack of information. Is we just don't know. We don't have the words. We don't have the perspective. We don't have the framework, the map, whatever you want to call it. And that when you start giving people that new schema, that all of a sudden, and that schema is created through a lot of different experiences, like I said, emotionally, cognitively, interpersonally. I mean, it has so many different dimensions to it. And so that's part of the unfolding of our consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Now, it is a very interesting thing, Herb. I love the idea of the rheostat that you say about how it just goes on like a dimmer switch, right? But I think there's another way to think about it too, which I think that's right. And I also think that it's also more, sometimes it's more that we turn the switch up and then we live with that for a while.
Oh, yes.
Integrate. See, this is where integration becomes so important, because I've seen this happen in therapy. When someone has a new experience, it's almost like their mind, they're confused for a while and like trying to, how do I, put this new piece of the puzzle or new piece into the puzzle, which then causes them to reorganize and change the whole puzzle. We talk sometimes about Jung's letter, and Jung talking about how it is necessary to have a displacement of these old ideas we have and have a complete reorganization and a new concept that now replaces these old ideas. And part of that is what we're talking about is that we get engaged, we challenge certain things, we integrate those, and then we're ready for another step in our development. And we see that. Bill said it so well when he said, more will be revealed. And my God, Herb, look at what's revealed to you at this point in your recovery versus, in the early days. I mean, you're so different. I mean, I'm so different. Roger, I've known you for a long time. You're so different now at this point in your life. I mean, I think with old age, there's not only been a deterioration of our bodies, but been an increase in our consciousness.
Well, but I think that's the integration you're talking about.
Yes.
That's the wisdom process. That's why young people can hardly be wisdom people, because they haven't made enough mistakes and corrected them.
That's true. And that is how we learn. But there's in our culture, there's such a strong taboo against making mistakes and failing, right?
Yes.
You gotta be successful. That's the only thing that counts, winning is everything, so to speak. And, and it creates such a difficult climate for us to grow ourselves as human beings, right? I mean, we need something that's a lot roomier and has a lot more space to it. And that's part of what happens as our consciousness changes. It becomes roomier. We expand our consciousness. And it's an incredible experience. And look, the wonderful thing is what all of us do, or the three of us do, is we get to watch people do that.
Yeah.
And we have the gift of sitting with people and seeing their consciousness unfold, or have those aha moments, right? There's nothing like it.
Well, one of the driving forces for me, I think there's probably many, but one is I suffered because I didn't know, and I didn't know that I didn't know. And I do those workshops so that people can at least begin to get to know. And something you said, Alan, about the others' words and experiences help people put things into words and have their own experiences. One of the best reasons for meetings where there's a community of people sharing honestly their words, their experiences, their knowledge, that kind of thing, is I see it all the time in the workshops where people go, oh, I had no words for that. Thank you for sharing your experience, because now I have words for it.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.